I never planned to come back to Ravens Point. Not after what happened when I was 17. Not after the night I broke one of my mother's rules. The second rule, specifically, and saw something that hollowed out a piece of me I've never been able to fill again. I told myself I would never breathe this town's air again, and for almost 16 years I kept that promise. Then my mother died. The call reached me in Anchorage in the cramped apartment I'd been renting month to month. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheriff Lowell, who sounded exactly the same as I remembered, steady, unbothered, as if nothing in this world could rattle him unless it wanted to. "I'm sorry, Marcus. She passed last night. Quietly. Quietly." Though nothing in Ravens Point was ever truly quiet. I drove back the next morning through a stretch of forest that grew denser the further north I went, until the pines pressed so close to the road they looked like an audience leaning in, waiting for the story to continue. The sky was heavy, gray, never fully bright, even though it was barely past noon. That was normal for this time of year. Still, I felt watched, observed, and I knew the sensation wasn't new. It was a memory resurfacing. Ravens Point appeared around a bend like it had materialized out of mist. Small, humble, huddled against the rocky shoreline of the Pacific. The same crooked marina, the same squat houses with their paint perpetually peeling from the salt wind, and above it all, the same cliffs rising like dark ribs from an ancient carcass. I used to swear the cliffs hummed at night. My mother always told me it was the wind. But I know now what the wind sounds like. And that noise was not the wind. As I drove through town, the first thing I noticed was that people still avoided eye contact after dusk. They still walked fast once the shadows lengthened. Their shoulders hunched the same way mine had as a child, like they were bracing against something the rest of the world didn't acknowledge, something that hovered just outside the visible spectrum. And strange as it sounds, I felt something like relief. At least I hadn't imagined all of it. At least the rules hadn't been mere paranoia. My mother's house sat at the edge of town, where the forest pressed close behind it and the sea stretched endlessly in front. I parked my car and sat for a minute, looking at the weathered siding, the sagging porch, the curtains drawn tight even though no one had been alive inside for a week. The air tasted of brine and cold metal. I'd forgotten that particular sharpness. Inside, the house smelled exactly as it had when I was a boy. Cedar, old books, and the faint medicinal scent my mother always carried with her. It made me pause in the doorway as my chest tightened. Everything was just as she'd left it. The little wooden table in the kitchen, the faded rug in the living room, the photograph of my father who died when I was 6, frozen in that same quiet half-smile. And near the hallway wall, pinned with a dull brass tack, hung the same wrinkled sheet of paper I hadn't seen since the day I left. The 5 rules. I froze. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. She'd kept them up all these years. I stepped closer, my throat going dry as I read them, each one written in her neat, unwavering handwriting. 1. Do not look out the windows after 10 p.m. 2. Always answer when someone calls your name, unless the voice comes from behind you. 3. If you hear footsteps inside the closet, recite the prayer I taught you and do not open the door. 4. During the blue light, remain silent and stay indoors. 5. Never go to the docks on a moonless night. I whispered the last rule aloud before I realized it. My voice shook. That rule, that was the one she'd caught me trying to break when I was 12. She'd slapped me for it, the only time she ever laid a hand on me. The fear in her eyes had been so real that I cried not from pain, but from the sudden awareness that something terrible waited just beyond the edges of this town's fragile order. And then there was the second rule, the one I did break, the rule that ruined everything. A floorboard creaked behind me. I jolted, heart hammering, before I remembered the house was old, the wood warped by years of settling and storms. Still, I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder. The hallway stretched empty. I exhaled shakily. Maybe coming back was a mistake. After dropping my bags, I walked to the kitchen where a half-used candle sat on the windowsill. I lit it out of habit. My mother always believed in small lights during long nights. Darkness listens, she used to say. Light reminds it you are not prey. As a kid, I thought it was poetic superstition. Now, I wasn't so sure. Outside, the gloom thickened. The sea churned restlessly against the rocks. I glanced at my watch. Only 6:30, but it already looked like night was waiting to swallow the town whole. I sat at the kitchen table and let memories bleed in. The first time I asked my mother why we had rules, she told me they were for safety. When I pressed for more, she said only, "There are things in this world we don't see, Marcus. Some by choice, some because we aren't meant to." Then she'd ruffled my hair, kissed my temple, and told me not to worry. But I did worry. I always worried. The rules weren't chores or boundaries, they were warnings. Lines drawn around something larger, stranger, and infinitely more terrifying than anything I could name. A knock at the front door pulled me from my thoughts. Sharp, steady. Not impatient, but confident. I stood slowly. Something in me bristled. Ravens Point didn't get visitors after dusk. Nobody knocked at night. I hesitated before approaching. The candle behind me flickered as if something had exhaled across the room. I reached the door but didn't open it. "Who is it?" A moment of silence. Then a voice I didn't recognize, warm but strange, said, "Marcus Hale, welcome home." My stomach dropped, not because of the words, but because they came from slightly too low, as if the speaker were crouched or standing on uneven ground. "Who are you?" I asked. The person on the other side chuckled softly, a sound like fabric stretching. "Just someone who's glad you returned. We've all been waiting." The candle flame thrashed violently behind me. I stepped back from the door. "You should rest," the voice continued. "It'll be a long night. And remember, a pause, a breath. Don't look out your windows after 10. Ice crawled up my spine. A second later, the footsteps retreated down the porch, but they didn't sound like just one set. They echoed, overlapping, soft, wet, and uneven, as if someone were dragging something behind them, or as if several feet moved together without rhythm, without coordination. I stood frozen until the sounds faded. When I checked my watch again, my pulse spiked. It was 10 p.m. exactly. I backed away from the window without meaning to. The house pressed in around me. The candle went still. And somewhere outside, too close, far too close, I heard the faintest tap on the glass. Just one. Then another. And then a whisper. My name. The whisper of my name clung to the glass long after the sound itself faded. I stood in the center of the kitchen, barely breathing, afraid that even the smallest exhale might count as a response. The rules came back to me with perfect clarity. Clarity they'd never had when I was a child. Maybe fear sharpens memory. Maybe dread dredges up what you thought you'd forgotten. Rule 1, do not look out the windows after 10 p.m. So I didn't. Not even when the tapping came again. Softer this time, like a fingernail testing the thinness of the barrier between us. I stayed still until the silence pressed so tightly around me that I could hear my heartbeat echo in my ears. Only when several minutes passed without another sound did I finally allow myself to move, slowly, deliberately, toward my old bedroom. The house creaked in a way that felt synchronized, as though each shift of wood and nail wasn't random, but responding to my footsteps, answering them, mimicking them. I stopped twice in the hallway just to listen. When the house fell quiet, an irrational wave of relief washed over me. I hadn't felt something like that since I was 17. In my bedroom, I didn't turn on the overhead light. Instead, I lit another candle. My mother had dozens scattered everywhere, as though she'd spent the last years of her life preparing for darkness to catch her unaware. The flame's glow painted my childhood walls in trembling gold. Old posters peeled at the corners. The bed sagged slightly in the middle. A shelf near the window still held the wooden whale carving my father made before he died. Dust softened every edge. I set my bag down and sank onto the bed, but I didn't sleep. Not yet. Not with the whisper still living in the back of my skull. After nearly half an hour of trying to calm myself, I spotted a cardboard box wedged beneath the nightstand, one I didn't remember. I knelt and tugged it out. The tape was brittle, easy to peel away. Inside was a stack of notebooks tied with a faded ribbon. My mother's handwriting covered each cover. Journal, 1999, Journal 2002, for Marcus. Do not read until I'm gone. My breath caught at the sight of the last one. The words felt like they vibrated, as if they carried the residual weight of everything she'd never said to me. My hands shook slightly as I picked it up. For a long moment, I just stared at the notebook resting in my palms. It felt heavier than it should have, too heavy, as though she had poured her entire being into these pages. As though the ink itself might be alive, I opened to the first page. Marcus, if you're reading this, then I'm no longer here to keep you safe. I'm sorry. Not for dying, but for leaving you with questions I never let you ask. I swallowed hard. The candle flickered as I sat down, the flame bending toward me like it was listening. You deserve to know the truth about the rules. I didn't invent them. I learned them from the same place your father did. From the same place our whole town quietly agreed to obey. My throat tightened. My father had known he had been part of this too. I kept reading. It is not evil. Evil requires intention. This is older than intention, older than thought, older than meaning. It sleeps, and when it stirs, reality thins. Just enough for things to slip. Sounds that should not speak begin to speak. Shapes that should not look begin to look. The air in the room grew cold, as though the candle's heat evaporated between one breath and the next. I forced myself to continue. That is why we do not look out the window after 10. Not because of what is outside, but because of what is not fully outside. What is half here and half somewhere else. What sees attention as invitation. The memory hit me all at once. Being 14, the night I caught a glimpse of something along the tree line, flickering like a broken image in a damaged film reel. My mother dragging me away before I could stare too long. The way the shape seemed to pulse, not moving toward me but unfolding, as though space was a sheet that something enormous pressed against from the other side. My hands trembled. I turned the page. You broke the second rule when you were 17. You heard the voice. You answered. My stomach hollowed. The journal continued. I never told you what answered back. Not fully. I only told you to leave because I knew if you stayed, it would finish what it began. I hoped distance would keep you safe. I hoped you'd forget. But the thing about the rules, Marcus, is that they follow the blood. They follow memory. They follow you. A sudden gust rattled the window behind me. I flinched, clutching the journal. The tapping resumed. Only once. A single precise knock. Not urgent. Not pleading, almost reminding. I shut the notebook quickly and backed away from the window until my shoulders pressed against the door. Don't look, don't look, don't look. I stared at the floorboards, breathing through my teeth. After a moment, the candle flickered violently, then steadied. The tapping did not return. Eventually, though I don't know how long it took, I worked up the courage to set the journal aside. My chest ached with every heartbeat. The room felt smaller, the shadows deeper, and the silence between them alive in a way that made me afraid to move. I lay on the bed without undressing, more out of paralysis than exhaustion. The candle burned low. My eyelids felt heavy. Just as sleep began to pull me under, I heard it. A soft creak. Not from the window, not from the hallway, but from the closet. A footstep, then another. Slow, deliberate, coming from inside. My blood ran cold. Rule 3 sharpened in my mind with terrifying clarity. If you hear footsteps inside the closet, recite the prayer I taught you and do not open the door. I sat up slowly, pulse pounding in my throat. My mouth went dry as bone. The footsteps stopped as soon as I listened for them. Then, something brushed the inside of the closet door. A faint pressure, like fingertips, sliding across the wood. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to recall the prayer, a lullaby, really, that my mother used to whisper when the nights grew strange. I heard myself murmur it out loud, voice shaking, light above, light within, hold the veil and draw it thin, stay the dark and keep it near, but let it not come fully here. Silence followed. Thick. Waiting. Then a whisper. Not my name this time, just a breath that did not belong to anything human. I froze for several eternal seconds. The room held its inhale, and then the closet went still, completely. The air warmed, the candle steadied, the pressure in my ears dissipated. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined all of it, if grief and exhaustion had conspired to twist old fears into waking hallucinations. But then I heard a final sound. The quietest of whispers, barely audible over the surf outside. A voice that wasn't behind me, wasn't ahead of me, but seemed to come from everywhere at once. A voice saying, "Welcome home, Marcus." I woke the next morning with the sensation that someone had been standing over me. Not touching, not speaking, just watching. The air in the room felt disturbed in a way I couldn't describe, like a presence had left only seconds before I opened my eyes. The candle beside my bed had burned down to a puddle of wax. The closet door remained shut. I exhaled slowly, realizing I'd slept in my clothes, curled in a tense half-fetal position like a child hiding from a storm. A faint ache throbbed behind my eyes. Whether from lack of sleep, the journal, or the footsteps, I couldn't tell. Downstairs, pale morning light seeped reluctantly through the curtains. I checked the windows before opening them. No fingerprints on the glass, no condensation, nothing to indicate someone or something had tapped at them hours earlier. Part of me wanted to believe I'd imagined everything. But the rules never existed because of imagination. After a long, scalding shower, I left the house, partly to breathe air that wasn't filled with ghosts of childhood, partly because I couldn't stand how every shadow corner felt like it was leaning toward me. The streets outside were quiet in the way only small Alaskan towns can be, tight-lipped, watchful, and burdened by too much weather and too little sunlight. I made my way toward the center of town. The buildings looked smaller than I remembered. The grocery store's hand-painted sign was peeling from the salt air. The diner still had the same flickering neon open sign that had been broken since I was 10. A fishing boat sat on blocks beside the mechanic's shop, rust spreading across its hull like a slow infection. A few people nodded as I passed, their expressions polite but distant. Some of them whispered after I walked by. "He's back. Did you hear? Why now?" Ravens Point had always been like this. Everyone polite to your face, terrified behind closed doors. Except the fear wasn't of each other. Not really. I entered the diner mostly because the cold had seeped through my jacket and my fingers felt stiff. A bell above the door chimed too loudly as I stepped inside. The warmth hit me like a blanket, heavy with the smell of grease, coffee, and something sweet baking in the back. A woman wearing a faded apron turned from the counter. For a moment she squinted, and I wondered if she recognized me. Then her face softened. "Marcus?" she asked. "Marcus Hale?" I blinked. "Jenny?" She laughed, a soft, relieved sound. "God, you look older." "So do you," I said, but she didn't, not really. Her hair was pulled back in the same messy bun she'd had in high school, and her freckles were exactly where I remembered them. She gestured to a booth. "Sit. Coffee? You look like you need it." "I do." Once I settled into the booth, she poured a hot cup and sat across from me, something she never would have done if any other customers had been there. People in Ravens Point didn't sit casually during daylight. They moved. Always moved, as if staying still made them easier to notice. She studied me for a moment. "I heard about your mom. I'm sorry." I nodded, staring into my coffee. "Thanks. You staying long?" "I haven't decided yet." Jenny pushed a sugar container toward me. "You should be careful." I looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Her eyes flicked toward the diner's fog-clouded windows. "There was a blue light last week." My stomach tightened. "I saw something last night," I murmured before I realized I was speaking aloud. Jenny went rigid. "What did you see?" "Not the light," I clarified. "Just something at the window." Her expression shifted from concern to dread. Real dread. The kind that makes you sit very, very still. Before she could respond, someone slid into the booth beside me. I nearly jumped. It was Sheriff Lowell. His uniform looked older than he did. His beard had gone gray in the year since I left, but his eyes hadn't changed. They were still cool, steady, as unrateable as deep water. "Morning, Marcus," he said. "Sheriff?" He nodded at Jenny, who took the hint and stood. "I'll be back," she murmured, though her face remained tight. Lowell folded his hands on the table. Heard you came in late last night. Everything all right at the house? The question was too casual. I forced a shrug. Old houses make noise. He didn't blink. You planning to stay? I'm handling the property. Beyond that, I'm not sure. The sheriff leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Then let me give you a piece of advice. Don't go wandering after dark. Your mother followed the rules for a reason. My jaw tightened. You still believe in all that? He didn't smile. Belief has nothing to do with it. The silence between us thickened. Saw your lights were off at 10, he added. That's good. Ice crawled up my spine. You were watching? Marcus. His voice softened, but not in a comforting way. You know as well as I do that people who ignore the rules don't stay in Ravens Point for long. I stared at him. His eyes were the same calm I remembered from childhood. Calm like someone who has lived too close to the edge for too long and knows the only way to survive is not to look down. Something about his expression made me ask, what happened last week? He didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter. The light lasted 12 minutes. Too long. People heard things they shouldn't have. 2 fishermen haven't been back since. I swallowed. Lost at sea? No. He held my gaze. They didn't go near the water. My blood ran cold. Before I could ask anything else, the bell above the door chimed again. A man walked in, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing layers of worn flannel. He glanced at me. His expression didn't waver, but something in his eyes tightened. He sat at the counter and didn't order. He just watched. Lowell straightened. I should go. Funeral's tomorrow. I'll check in on you after. Why? Because your mother asked me to. My breath stalled. When? A month ago. A month ago, long before she died. Long before I knew I'd be coming back. The sheriff stood, nodded once, and left the diner. I stared after him, unsure if the tremor in my hands was from fear or cold. Jenny returned with a plate of toast and eggs. He warned you, didn't he? He said the rules still matter. They do. I hesitated. Does everyone still follow them? Jenny looked toward the group of older men playing cards in the corner, toward the solitary man at the counter who hadn't taken his eyes off me, toward the windows where the fog pressed like a creature trying to breathe through glass. Her voice became a whisper. They follow them because they learned what happens to people who don't. My memory flickered, my mother dragging me away from the window, the shape outside unfolding, the night the voice called my name and something answered. Jenny leaned closer. You shouldn't stay, Marcus. I don't think I have a choice, she swallowed. Then whatever you do, don't go near the docks. I know, I said. No, she whispered, shaking her head. I mean now, today, before it gets dark. My breath caught. Why? She didn't answer. Because she didn't have to. Because the man at the counter rose slowly from his stool, his chair scraping the tile in a sound that made the hairs on my neck rise. He kept his face turned away from her, but his eyes, flat, unblinking, stayed on me as he moved. Welcome home, Marcus, he said softly as he passed. My heart seized. It was the same voice from last night, except this time it came from the front, not behind me, which meant whatever had whispered my name in the dark had not been this man. That night, I lay in my childhood bed, but sleep did not come easily. The memory of the diner, the man at the counter, and Jenny's whispered warning churned in my mind. The candle flickered on the nightstand, casting shadows that twisted into impossible shapes on the walls. I tried to read the journal again, but the words seemed to shift on the page, as if they were alive, or responding to something outside my comprehension. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me, but not in the usual way. My dreams did not begin gently. They crashed over me like ice water. I was standing on the docks, the same moonless docks my mother had forbidden me to visit. The wooden planks stretched out endlessly, warped and slick with seawater. Beyond them, the ocean was a black mirror that seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own. Waves licked at the edges of my consciousness, but I heard no splash, no wind. The sea moved as if alive, responding to a silent signal. Then I heard it, a voice, low and undulating, calling my name. Not from behind me, not from ahead, but from everywhere at once. Marcus, I spun, heart hammering, and saw nothing but the dark water and the endless planks. Then, in the reflection of the water, a shape emerged. Not fully formed, not fully visible, like a photograph of a shadow stretched over itself, a memory of something alive but imperfectly captured. It moved, but it was wrong. Not in direction, not in speed, but in dimension. It didn't cast a shadow, it didn't disturb the water. It simply existed. A presence so massive that the mind tried to simplify it, but simplification was impossible. I felt myself shrinking inside, my body somehow smaller than the planks beneath me, my mind thinner than the fog that crept along the dock. This was not fear in the conventional sense. Fear assumes you can fight, you can survive, you can escape. This was recognition of something so vast, so unconcerned with my existence that I could only tremble and observe. Then the voice again, closer this time. "Do you remember the rules?" I nodded, even though no one could see me. "Yes," I whispered. "I remember." "Good," it said, almost approvingly, "but remembering is not enough. You must obey." The surface of the water rippled, not from wind, not from waves, but from something moving beneath. I could sense it, not see it, a colossal form shifting in slow, deliberate arcs. My stomach turned as I realized the water's reflection was wrong. The moonless sky bent unnaturally, the stars twisted into spirals that I knew could not exist. The universe itself seemed flexible here. I tried to turn and run, but my feet were frozen. The planks beneath me felt unreal, like memory, like something painted over an impression of a dock. The voice grew impatient. "Do not look beyond the edges. Do not break the rules. You have done so once. Never again." Then, without warning, the shape rose partially out of the water, like a black tide curling toward me. I could not comprehend its height, its mass, its form. Every instinct in me screamed to flee, yet I could not move. I only watched as the impossible figure hung in the darkness, heavy with indifference. A sudden, blinding light, the blue light, I realized with sickening certainty, spread across the horizon. It was wrong for the hour, wrong for the season, and yet undeniably real. The water glowed, the sky glowed, and the reflection of the docks fractured into impossible angles. My mind began to crack, unable to reconcile the geometry, the physics, the very rules I thought governed reality. "Do you understand now?" the voice whispered. "No," I admitted, my throat raw. "Then listen carefully," it said, and I felt the air vibrate against me, a soundless pressure. The rules exist because reality is a tissue. Pull too hard, look too long, speak when you should be silent, and the fabric tears. I wanted to wake. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my mouth remained shut, my eyes fixed on the impossible shape and the impossibly fractured light. I felt something ancient watching me from beneath the docks, something unconcerned with my life but very much aware of it. Then a sudden flash, and I awoke in my bed, sweating, shaking, my heart hammering in a rhythm that seemed entirely foreign. The candle had gone out. The room smelled faintly of salt and wood rot. I pressed my hand to the nightstand and found the journal lying open, as if someone had placed it there while I slept. On the page in front of me, a single line, scrawled in handwriting I knew intimately. "The docks remember. The water listens. Do not return until you know why." I stared at it, paralyzed. The dream had felt too real to dismiss and too coherent to be random. And yet I had been sleeping, alone in the safety of my mother's house, or what I thought was safety. I realized then that the rules were not just instructions, they were survival mechanisms. They were bridges between my fragile perception of reality and something so vast, so ancient, that my mind couldn't fully contain it. And I knew that if I disobeyed them again, if I ever returned to the docks on a moonless night, I would not merely face fear. I would face something older than fear, older than myself, and completely indifferent to my existence. As I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the darkened closet, I knew the nightmares had only begun. The next day passed in a tense blur. I tried to busy myself with chores around the house, stacking firewood, dusting the old shelves, checking the perimeter for damage from storms, but my attention was fractured. Every sound, every creak, every whisper of wind through the cracks of the old house set my nerves on edge. Ravens Point had a way of reminding you that even the ordinary had weight. Even the mundane carried an echo of something. Not quite right. By late afternoon, clouds thickened into a low, suffocating ceiling. The sea outside churned with unnatural restlessness, the waves louder and slower than normal. I poured myself a cup of coffee and tried to read, but the words swam on the page. My mind kept replaying the dream from the night before. The impossible geometry of the docks, the pulsing reflection in the water, the whispering voice. And then, as the sun sank below the horizon, the sky changed. It was subtle at first, a faint bluish shimmer on the horizon as if a distant lamp had been lit. The glow grew quickly, unnatural and unrelenting. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, the same dread I had known as a boy whenever the blue light appeared. Rule 4. During the blue light, remain silent and stay indoors. I moved quickly, shutting the windows and drawing the curtains. The air felt charged, almost liquid. My skin tingled, my hair stood on end. The house seemed to pulse with the light outside, its walls breathing in tandem with the ocean. I could hear faint noises from beyond, footsteps, whispers, the creak of planks, though no one was there. My mother's words returned to me from her journal. The rules exist because reality is a tissue. Pull too hard, look too long, speak when you should be silent, and the fabric tears. I stayed in the corner of the living room, knees drawn up, watching the walls glow with that unearthly blue. Time fractured. Minutes stretched into hours. My ears picked up patterns that my conscious mind could not interpret. Soft rhythmic thuds, high-pitched metallic hums, and a low undertone that seemed to vibrate through my chest. Then I heard it. Not the whisper from last night, not the voice that called my name. Something else. A chorus. A layering of tones that sounded like multiple entities speaking in unison, yet with no intention I could recognize. It wasn't language, it was observation, it was attention. It was the cosmos itself brushing against the fragile membrane of the world. The sensation was dizzying. My body refused to cooperate. I tried to look away, to close my eyes, but the light had no source. It filled the room regardless of where I turned. I felt small, infinitely small, as if the very universe had decided to notice me for the first time. And that notice was neither kind nor hostile, only absolute. I wanted to pray, to recite my mother's words, to cling to any fragment of the rules I remembered. But fear stole my breath. Fear that the rules might fail, or that I might fail them. Fear that by simply existing in this light, I had already broken something fundamental. Then came movement. At first, subtle, shadows along the walls, stretching and folding in ways that defied geometry. Then more pronounced. Shapes emerging that could not exist in three-dimensional space. They lingered at the edges of vision, crawling up walls, across ceilings, through corners. I realized with sudden clarity that they were not shadows at all. They were impressions, echoes of forms existing in dimensions I could not perceive. I shut my eyes tightly, and for a brief, disorienting moment, the room went black. But the blue light remained, leaking through my eyelids, and then I heard the voice. "Do you remember the rules, Marcus?" I could not respond. My tongue refused. My throat ached as if speaking aloud might tear the fragile barrier between the world I knew and whatever lay beneath Ravens Point. "You have done well to come home," it continued, "but knowing is not enough. Watching is not enough. You must obey." The air grew heavier. I felt pressure at my chest, as though gravity itself had concentrated on me, pinning me to the floor. My mind began to fray, strands of memory unraveling. Childhood, adolescence, every mistake, every fear, every glance out of a window, all bled together into a single, incomprehensible awareness. I was insignificant, entirely insignificant, and then the light began to recede, slowly, painfully, like a tide retreating. The oppressive pressure lifted. The shapes in the corners dissolved into nothingness, leaving the room unnaturally still. I exhaled, trembling, as the ordinary darkness of night reclaimed the house. The only sound was my own heartbeat, ragged and loud in my ears. I realized I had survived. I did not know why. I did not know how. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The rules were not arbitrary. They were survival. They were guidance. They were the boundary between the thin membrane of our reality and something so vast, so ancient that it could not care about my life, except to remind me that I existed. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, trying to steady my mind. The journal lay open on the table beside me, its pages heavy with warnings and explanations I could barely comprehend. The words were not merely guidance. They were proof. Proof that the world I thought I knew was fragile. That the house, the town, the sea, everything was only a thin veneer covering a vast indifference. When I finally forced myself to sleep, it was fitful, haunted by fragmented images of impossible angles, pulsing shapes, and whispered names. I dreamed again of the docks, of the water-bending space, of something beneath, waiting patiently, unconcerned, eternal. Morning came. The light was ordinary, mercifully ordinary, but I knew it would not last. Ravens Point never allowed ordinary for long. The rules were still here. The town was still here. And I was still very much part of both, whether I wanted to be or not. Sleep offered no comfort that night. When I closed my eyes, I found myself back at 17, standing in the hallway outside my bedroom, trembling with anticipation and fear. The rule I had broken, Rule 2, always answer when someone calls your name unless the voice comes from behind you, had been simple, yet its violation had unleashed horrors I could barely comprehend. I remembered the voice that night, soft and insistent, calling my name from somewhere beyond my door. It was not my mother, not anyone I knew. But I had responded anyway. I had stepped into the darkness, into the corridor where the shadows pooled like thick oil, and my curiosity had carried me further than I should have gone. I remembered the shape I glimpsed when I turned the corner. Not a person, not an animal, not even a shadow that made sense. It was taller than the ceiling, its edges blurred and folding in on themselves. A mass of geometry and absence at once. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth, yet it had noticed me. I could feel its attention pressing against the small bubble of self I thought was mine. I had screamed. My mother had appeared moments later, slapping my hands away from the wall, dragging me backward, murmuring the prayers she had taught me. But even in that moment of safety, I had known something fundamental had shifted. The world beyond Ravens Point, the world that existed outside the fragile rules, had acknowledged me. And acknowledgement, I had learned, was the first step toward unraveling. Now, lying in my childhood bed, I realized that I had never truly left that moment. Time, it seemed, had stretched backward and forward in a way that made the past as vivid as the present. The town had waited for me, all these years, its silence and obedience a shield against the vast, indifferent thing beneath the cliffs and the docks. I picked up my mother's journal again, tracing the lines with trembling fingers. You broke the second rule when you were 17. You heard the voice. You answered. The words burned into my mind. I could almost hear the whisper again, feel the pulse of it vibrating in my chest. And I realized with a shiver that I had returned, not because I wanted to, not because I was curious, but because something had called me back. Something in the town had remembered me, had waited for my return. I sat there for hours, the candle guttering and the shadows of the room twisting like living things. Every sound in the house, every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the windows felt amplified. The rules were no longer abstract. They were urgent. They were alive. And then I thought of the docks. I had never wanted to go there, not even as a child. My mother's warning had been absolute, never go to the docks on a moonless night. I had broken other rules, tested other boundaries, but this one had remained intact, a line I had never crossed. Yet now, after seeing the blue light, after hearing the chorus of voices and sensing the presence beneath the water, I understood the gravity of that rule in a way I never had before. It wasn't just a prohibition. It was a boundary, a shield, a layer of protection against forces that could unmake me, that could dissolve the world as I knew it into fragments I could not endure. And yet, the pull of curiosity, the same pull that had made me answer the voice at 17, was growing again. Not a reckless desire, not simple temptation, but a gnawing need to understand, to see, to confront what had been waiting for me all these years. I forced myself to breathe. The memories were too vivid, the sense of presence too strong. I could feel my pulse in my throat, my hands trembling as if the rules themselves were whispering against my skin. I knew I needed to prepare, to steel myself, to remember everything my mother had taught me. The prayers, the cautions, the rituals, all of it mattered more than ever. And then, just before sleep reclaimed me, I remembered one last thing about that night, 16 years ago. The whispering voice had said something else, something I had blocked from memory until now. Do not look beyond the edges, Marcus. Do not break the rules, but remember you are already known. Those words echoed in my mind as darkness claimed me. Known. Not hunted, not threatened, not condemned, just known. The weight of that recognition was heavier than fear, heavier than guilt. It pressed against the edges of my mind like the tide against the cliffs. I realized then that the past and present were not separate. The rules had always been a tether, keeping me anchored to reality, keeping me from being unmade by forces beyond comprehension. And by returning to Ravens Point, I had stepped back onto that tether, whether I understood it or not. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by glimpses of the shape I had seen at 17, by fragments of impossible geometry, and by the voice that had called my name. And when I awoke, I knew with certainty that the past was not finished with me. The town was not finished with me. And whatever lay beneath Ravens Point, vast and indifferent, was waiting. The next morning, I awoke to a peculiar silence, not the ordinary quiet of Ravens Point, where the wind and sea and distant gulls combined into a muted symphony, but a deliberate, unnatural stillness. The usual creaks of the house were absent. The distant rumble of the ocean seemed muffled, as if the world had taken a breath and paused. I hesitated before moving from the bed, listening. And then I heard it. A whisper. Faint and sibilant, coming from somewhere within the walls themselves. Not a voice I recognized, not my mother's, not anyone in town. Just a language of soft, deliberate tones, impossible to parse, but unmistakably sentient. Rule 2 and Rule 3 flared in my mind. Don't answer if the voice comes from behind you. Recite the prayer and do not open the door if footsteps come from the closet. But these whispers didn't have a source behind a door, nor from a closet. They were embedded in the house itself, in its wood, in its plaster, in the very air. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine and moved cautiously toward the kitchen, gripping the journal tightly. The shadows clung to the corners, thicker than they should have been, writhing almost imperceptibly as though alive. Each step I took seemed to resonate through the walls, sending the whispers into a heightened frenzy. The journal lay open where I had left it. I ran my fingers over the words, desperate for guidance. My mother's handwriting seemed to throb on the page as if it had absorbed the house's agitation. Marcus, the walls remember. They echo what the town has forgotten. Do not listen too closely. Do not respond. They are patient, but not kind. They will know if you waver. I felt my pulse accelerate. The words were not just instructions, they were warnings against curiosity itself, against the temptation to understand. The house was alive in a way I had never fully acknowledged, and my return had awakened something dormant. I stepped into the living room. The whispering grew louder, yet remained indecipherable. It was as if 1,000 voices spoke at once, overlapping, each one trying to convey something important but beyond my capacity to grasp. I tried to shut it out, covering my ears, muttering fragments of the prayer I had learned long ago. It helped only marginally. The sound was too pervasive. Then came the first footstep, soft, deliberate, coming from the hallway. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Rule 3. I recited the prayer aloud, shaking, light above, light within, hold the veil and draw it thin, stay the dark and keep it near, but let it not come fully here. The step paused, then another. Closer. Each step was deliberate, precise, yet not entirely human. I felt the floor vibrate beneath me, though the boards remained intact. My heart raced as I backed toward the kitchen, journal clutched to my chest. The footsteps stopped. The whispers from the walls fell silent, replaced by an oppressive, almost tactile expectation. I was aware of every grain of dust, every crack in the floor, every faint creak of the ceiling. The house was alive with attention, and it was focused entirely on me. A shadow detached itself from the corner of the room. I didn't see it form. It was already there, stretched impossibly, a dark ripple against the dim morning light. The shape moved unnaturally, folding in on itself, corners bending like origami designed by some alien geometry. I could feel its presence pressing against the edges of perception, making my vision quiver, making the air itself taste metallic. I remembered my mother's warning about the docks, the blue light, the second rule. Everything was connected. The house, the town, the ocean, the cliffs, they were all extensions of something larger, something eternal, something that noticed when I spoke, when I moved, when I thought. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a chair, and the shadow seemed to hesitate. It was aware of me, acknowledged me. Then the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the walls like the town itself was pressing in, murmuring secrets it had long denied. Words began to coalesce, though the language was alien. I caught fragments. The membrane thins, attention is invitation, do not call, do not answer. I understood it not intellectually, but viscerally. To look, to respond, to acknowledge anything beyond the rules was to invite dissolution, to invite the attention of something so vast, so indifferent, that my very existence might unravel. I dropped to my knees, clutching the journal, muttering prayers, willing myself to be small, invisible, insignificant. The shadows twisted and wreathed, the air vibrated, the walls seemed to pulse with the whispers of 1,000 unremembered voices, and then silence. Absolute. I dared to look up. The shadow was gone. The whispers had receded. The house felt empty. Only the distant roar of the sea remained. I exhaled, trembling. My mother's warnings echoed through my mind, reminding me that surviving the night was not victory. It was a temporary reprieve. Raven's Point was patient. So were its rules. So was whatever waited beyond comprehension, lurking in the folds of reality that humans were not meant to perceive. I realized then that returning had not merely awakened memories. It had stirred forces I did not yet understand, forces that the town had long obeyed through ritual and fear. And I knew that before I could endure the coming nights, before I could even hope to confront my past mistakes, I needed answers. But the town, the house, and the cliffs would not give them freely. They were waiting, and so was I. I spent the following morning in an uneasy daze, trying to convince myself that the house had returned to normal. The shadows seemed less insistent, the air lighter, though the faint echo of whispers lingered in corners where light didn't reach. I forced myself to eat a meager breakfast, sipping coffee far too bitter to taste, and stared at the journal sprawled open across the kitchen table. It was then that I noticed something I hadn't before. Tucked between the pages of the oldest notebook was a hand-drawn map. Not a simple sketch of Raven's Point, but a detailed layout of the cliffs, the docks, and the buildings along the shore. The map was annotated in my mother's meticulous handwriting. Notes about tides, shadows, and, most unsettling, small symbols I couldn't decipher. One section was circled in deep black ink near the water. Above it, in jagged letters, she had written, "Do not go here. Not until you understand the cost." My pulse quickened. I knew this was the spot my mother had always feared I would find, where the blue light often appeared, where the voice had first reached me, where the docks became less dock and more something other. I traced the map with a trembling finger, feeling the contours of the cliffs, the outline of the wooden pier, the stretch of water beyond. Even though I had lived in Raven's Point all my life, the map made the familiar strange. The ocean seemed darker, the air heavier, the space between each structure charged with unseen weight. And then I noticed another annotation, a series of lines connecting various houses, buildings, and natural features. Lines that formed an intricate pattern I couldn't understand. It looked almost like a ritual design, but not religious. Not symbolic in any human sense. More like a diagram of boundaries, barriers, and points of attention. I realized with a rising sense of dread that my mother had spent years recording not merely geography, but the limits of perception, the rules made visible, codified, mapped onto the land itself. Each mark, each line, each symbol was a tether, a way to keep something from slipping through. A sudden noise drew my attention, a soft tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, against the front door. I froze, the map clutched against my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, though it carried no weight, no shadow. It was as if the air itself had knocked. Rule 1. Do not look out the windows after 10 p.m. It wasn't 10 yet, but instinct screamed at me that waiting wouldn't matter. Something was pressing against the edges of awareness, trying to see, trying to be acknowledged. I crept toward the door, careful not to glance through the glass. The tapping stopped. I exhaled, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Wind, animal, memory, but the unease lingered. I returned to the map, forcing myself to study it despite my trembling hands. One of the circled areas included the forest beyond the cliffs, where fog tended to gather even on clear days. A tiny notation read, "Voices travel here. Do not answer. Do not follow." Another annotation along the shoreline closer to the pier, "Edges thin here. Watch but do not see." The precision of her warnings made my skin crawl. The rules were not arbitrary, and neither was her fear. Each one corresponded to a location on the map where reality itself was fragile, where whatever lurked beneath Raven's Point could touch this world. I realized then that the map was not just a guide. It was a warning, a record of survival. My mother had understood the patterns, the points of danger, the moments of vulnerability, and she had prepared me to obey, yet I couldn't help myself. Curiosity, that old dangerous companion, gnawed at me. I traced the path from the house to the docks, imagining what I might see, what might be waiting. The circled point on the map pulsed in my mind like a heartbeat, demanding attention. I tried to resist, repeating the prayers under my breath, but the lure was irresistible. The blue light had returned once. It could return again. And I knew, in the marrow of my bones, that when it did, the rules would not bend for me. I folded the map carefully and tucked it back between the pages, trying to convince myself that knowledge without action was safe. But even as I did, the house seemed to sigh, as though acknowledging my hesitation, noting my interest. Outside, the wind rose and carried with it a faint murmur, as if the cliffs themselves were speaking. The sea shifted, rolling in unnatural patterns. The world beyond the windows was calm, yet alive, watching, waiting. And I realized, as I sat back at the kitchen table clutching the journal, that the rules were not only about obedience. They were about understanding limits, about respecting boundaries that stretched beyond human comprehension. I had always known curiosity was dangerous. I had never understood just how lethal it could be. The map was proof. And somewhere, beyond the cliffs, beyond the docks, beyond the thin membrane of the world, something was waiting for me to fully understand it. That evening, I wandered toward the shore, careful to stay within the bounds of what the rules allowed. The sun had dipped low, bleeding pink and gold across the horizon, yet the air carried a chill that seemed unnatural for the hour. The docks were empty, as they always were, their wooden planks groaning faintly under the pressure of their own age. The blue light had not appeared yet, but its memory lingered in my mind like a stain. Every time I looked at the water, I imagined the shapes beneath. Colossal, indifferent, impossible. The rules had kept me safe until now. They had tethered me to the fragile reality of Raven's Point. But the pull toward the shore was irresistible. I walked carefully, noticing details I had never seen as a child. Barnacles clinging to the pilings, slick and sharp, the way the fog pressed into the nooks between buildings, the uneven spacing of planks that could easily send a misstep into the icy water. Everything seemed deliberate. Every imperfection, every irregularity seemed like part of a pattern I could not yet perceive. A figure appeared at the end of the pier, not moving, not walking, not alive in any sense I could name, but undeniably there. The air around it shimmered, as if it existed partially out of phase with the world. I froze, recognizing the shape from my dreams, the impossible geometry, edges folding into themselves, a form that should not be capable of occupying space, yet did. I forced myself to recall the rules. Do not answer voices from behind. Do not approach the docks on a moonless night. Obey the blue light's warning. Tonight was neither moonless nor the hour of the light, but the presence had a weight that defied rules. I wanted to run, but my legs felt anchored to the planks. I was small, insignificant, fully aware of my vulnerability. Then a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping on the pier's handrails. I could not tell whether it was deliberate or simply the decay of wood. My pulse thumped, deafening in my ears. And then I noticed the signs. Small markings carved into the pilings, subtle enough that I had never seen them as a child. Triangles, spirals, a pattern of dots arranged in strange symmetry. They corresponded with symbols in my mother's journal. Proof that she had known. Proof that the town had survived because someone had understood the language of the docks, the whispers in the planks, the weight of what lay beneath the water. A sudden gust of wind brought with it a faint whisper, incomprehensible but full of attention. My skin crawled. I realized as the voice swirled around me that the presence was aware of me not just as an intruder, but as a remembered entity. It knew who I was, what I had done, what rules I had broken. Marcus. The single word, soft and undulating, carried across the water. Not a call, not a warning, but recognition. I did not answer. I could not. The shape at the end of the pier shifted, impossibly, stretching wider than the horizon, yet contained within a single point of perception. My mind attempted to process it and failed. I felt my awareness expand and constrict at once, dizzying and painful. The edges of reality seemed to bend. The rules felt fragile. I stumbled backward, my hands scraping against the rough wood, and fell to my knees. The journal pressed against my chest like a talisman. The whispers became a chorus, rising and falling, overlapping in a rhythm I could not decode. They were warnings, observations, perhaps instructions I couldn't tell. And then the water moved. Not waves, not tides, but something beneath, shifting, aware, immense. The air carried a pressure I could feel in my bones. I wanted to scream, to flee, to acknowledge nothing, but the blue light's memory surged through me, the rules' warnings echoing in my mind. I crawled backward, leaning against the journal, closing my eyes and muttering prayers under my breath. The shape lingered, patient, indifferent, monumental. I realized then that it was testing me. Not with aggression, not with malice, but with observation. Watching was dangerous, acknowledgement was dangerous. Even recognition itself was dangerous. After what felt like hours, the presence receded slightly. The air relaxed. The water stilled. The whispers became faint again, retreating into the wood and the fog. I opened my eyes and saw the pier as it had been, ordinary and decaying, but with every plank and marking etched permanently into my memory. I knew one thing with certainty: the docks remembered me. The water had known me before I was aware. The town had prepared for me, or at least my mother had. And whatever lurked beneath, indifferent and eternal, was patient, waiting for me to learn the rules fully, or pay the cost. I rose slowly, careful not to look again, and turned back toward the house. The sky darkened above the cliffs, and for the first time, I understood that Ravens Point was not just a town, a memory, or a home. It was a guardian, a warning, a boundary drawn in fear and respect for something no human mind could comprehend. And I, having returned, had once again placed myself at the edge. The following day, I barely left the house. The events at the pier the night before lingered like a thick fog in my mind, clinging to every thought, every breath. The shadows in the corners of my mother's house seemed more active now, quivering slightly when I turned my head. Even the familiar creaks of the floorboards sounded different, deliberate, attentive, as if the house itself were measuring my resolve. By mid-afternoon, I heard it, the soft crunch of boots on gravel outside. My heart seized. Visitors were rare in Ravens Point. Strangers were rarer still. The journal warned me against acknowledging anyone who appeared unbidden. My pulse accelerated as I moved toward the window, careful to keep my face turned just enough to see without being seen. A figure emerged from the fog, tall, broad, wrapped in layers of heavy fabric. The mist seemed to cling to him unnaturally, swirling around his shoulders and legs as though resisting his passage. He paused briefly, looking toward the house, though I could not tell if he was looking at me or something beyond the glass. Then he moved on, vanishing as quickly as he appeared. I shivered. Durnall had never mentioned strangers. My mother's rules were about the town, about the house, about the docks and the cliffs and the sea. The thought of an outsider here, someone aware enough to navigate Ravens Point's hidden dangers, set my nerves on edge. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. I lit candles, checked the locks, reviewed the rules in my mind. Each one became a lifeline, a thread connecting me to a reality I was beginning to understand was thin and fragile. Rule 1, Rule 2, Rule 3. They were no longer suggestions, they were survival. As evening approached, fog rolled in from the cliffs, thick and suffocating. The sound of the ocean became muffled, distorted, almost alien. My mother's map lay open on the table, the circled points pulsing in my mind like warning lights. I knew the blue light could return at any moment. Then, a knock at the door. Soft, insistent, I froze. The journal thumped against my chest like a heartbeat. Every instinct screamed not to answer. Yet the voice came with it, not a human voice, but a sound that carried the weight of attention, almost a vibration through the wood itself. Marcus. I did not respond. I did not move. The knock came again, louder, more deliberate, resonating through the doorframe and into my bones. I felt the air shift, the fog pressing closer, carrying a cold metallic scent I couldn't place. I remembered the rules, I remembered the map, I remembered the warnings, the docks, the cliffs, the edges, the blue light, and most importantly, I remembered my mother's whispered advice. Do not answer, do not invite what watches. I sank to the floor, pressed my back against the wall, and whispered the prayers under my breath. The knocking continued for a while, then stopped abruptly. Silence returned, though it felt heavier now, charged with the weight of observation. Minutes passed, hours perhaps. I did not move, did not breathe more than necessary. Then I heard it, the faintest sound of boots retreating through the gravel, fading into the fog. The figure had gone. Or perhaps it had never been there in the way I understood presence. I waited until the night deepened, until the fog thickened into an almost tangible wall. Only then did I allow myself to rise and check the windows. Nothing. No footprints. No sign that anyone had passed. Only the fog, the cliffs, the indifferent ocean. I realized then that Ravens Point had layers I had not yet perceived. The town itself was aware. The docks were aware. The cliffs and the fog and the water were aware. And now, some stranger, or something masquerading as a stranger, had entered that awareness. I sat in the dim candlelight, journal in hand, and contemplated what this intrusion meant. Was it a test? A warning? A harbinger? The rules did not address outsiders. They never had. My mother's protections extended only so far. And then I remembered the man at the diner, the sheriff's caution, Jenny's whispered warnings, the whispers in the walls, and the shapes at the pier. Ravens Point was patient. It had waited 16 years for me. But perhaps the town's patience had limits, and now I was no longer alone. The next morning I resolved to speak to Jenny. She had always been a fixture in Ravens Point, quiet and watchful, the kind of person who noticed things other people didn't. As a teenager, I had confided in her some of the strange occurrences around the town, the whispers, the glimpses, the sense that reality itself had edges. She had never laughed or dismissed me, only nodded with a grave expression that now, years later, I could almost read as fear. I found her in the small cafe by the harbor, sweeping the floor with methodical precision. Her gray hair was pulled back, eyes sharper than I remembered. When she saw me, she paused, a flicker of recognition and apprehension crossing her face. You shouldn't be here, she said without preamble, her voice low, almost trembling. I had to come back, I replied. I needed to understand the rules, the docks, the blue light, the things I saw. Jenny's hand tightened on the broom handle. She gestured for me to sit at a corner table, away from the few patrons. Understanding isn't what saves you, she said. Obedience does. Knowing too much is dangerous. The town doesn't forgive curiosity. I opened the journal on the table, letting her glance at the map and the notes. Her eyes darkened as she recognized the markings. "You've been reading her instructions," Jenny said, nodding slowly. "You've seen the map, the circled points, the docks, the forest, the edges." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "Your mother did what she could to protect you, but she knew that one day someone would come back and attention would follow." I swallowed hard. "Attention? You mean what I saw at the pier, the shapes, the blue light, the whispers?" Jenny nodded. "It's always watching, always aware, not malicious, not kind, just indifferent. But if it notices you, truly notices, it can unravel the fragile boundaries your mother and the town have maintained for generations." I clenched the journal. "So the rules, they're not arbitrary?" "No," Jenny said. "They're the difference between survival and something worse. Do not break them, Marcus. Do not step beyond what is written or whispered. Do not answer when you should not. Do not look too long, and never ever return to the docks on a moonless night without knowing the cost." Her gaze lingered on mine, piercing, almost pleading. "You've been noticed already. Every shape, every whisper, every shift in the fog, they remember you. The blue light, the water, the cliffs, they will not forgive mistakes." I nodded, feeling the familiar weight of dread settle in my chest. "I understand, but I need to know. I need to see why my mother feared it so much." Jenny shook her head, her expression unreadable. "Understanding will not protect you. It only makes you braver, and braver is dangerous in Ravens Point. You came back, Marcus. The town knew. The cliffs, the docks, the fog, they knew. And now, attention follows. You cannot undo that." I left the cafe, Jenny's warning echoing in my mind. Outside, the fog rolled thickly over the docks, curling and twisting like living smoke. I could feel the memory of the shapes, the water, the blue light pressing against the edges of perception. As I walked home, I realized something chilling. Knowledge, curiosity, and even memory were not safe. They were invitations. Every step toward understanding was a step closer to unraveling the fragile membrane the town had maintained. By the time I returned to the house, the fog had thickened, the shadows longer and more deliberate. I pressed my back to the door, clutching the journal, and whispered the prayers. The rules were no longer just words, they were shields, fragile but absolute. And I knew with grim certainty that the attention that followed me was patient. It could wait. I could not. The rules were all I had left. That night, sleep came fitfully, haunted by fragments of Jenny's warning and memories of the blue light. I dreamed again of the docks, the water bending impossibly, shapes folding in on themselves, whispering my name. I woke with a start, gasping, the candle on my nightstand flickering as if reacting to my panic. The cliffs had always fascinated me as a child. They rose sharply above the ocean, jagged and cold, seemingly solid, but always carrying an air of instability. My mother's journal warned me not to linger near the edge after dark, especially on nights when the fog was thick. Tonight, however, the fog rolled in like a living tide, pressing against the windows, whispering of the sea, of what waited beneath. I couldn't ignore it. The journal's map indicated a point along the cliffs where several rules converged. The blue light often appeared here, the edges of perception thinned, and the town's whispered boundaries were weakest. It was also the only place where I might begin to understand why my mother had lived in fear. I wrapped a thick coat around myself and crept through the house, clutching the journal and map. Each step was deliberate, a prayer, a test of obedience. I could feel the house watching, the shadows pressing closer, but I didn't look back. The rules had taught me patience, taught me fear, taught me survival. The wind hit me as soon as I stepped outside, sharp, cold, carrying salt and the metallic tang of the ocean. The fog rolled in dense waves, obscuring the pier, the houses, the familiar shapes of Ravens Point. The cliffs loomed ahead, black and jagged, dissolving into the mist. As I approached, the air grew heavier, charged with something I could not name. My heart pounded, but I repeated the prayers under my breath, reciting the rules silently. I had survived the docks, the blue light, and the whispers in the walls, but this was different. The cliffs were ancient, indifferent, their edge a line between the world I knew and something far older. Then I saw it. A faint shimmer along the edge, a distortion in the air, like heat rising from asphalt in summer, but colder, darker, unnatural. Shapes flickered within it, impossible forms like the memory of geometry that should not exist. The shimmer pulsed gently, almost beckoning, almost alive. I forced myself to obey. I did not approach. I did not look too long. I whispered the prayers again, feeling the words vibrate in the mist. The map in my hand seemed heavier now, the circled point throbbing with significance. From within the fog came a sound I had not heard before, a low, harmonic resonance, neither human nor animal, rising and falling like waves, yet carrying intelligence. It was not angry. It was not kind. It was aware, fully aware of me. I remembered Jenny's words. They will not forgive mistakes. Attention follows. And I knew with sickening clarity that the cliffs had been waiting for me. Not the docks, not the water. The cliffs themselves, the land and the stone, patient and eternal, bending reality in subtle ways to remind me that I was insignificant. A sudden gust of wind shifted the fog and I glimpsed the water below, darker than the deepest night, almost black, moving in subtle ripples that betrayed the presence beneath. The blue light pulsed faintly, reflecting off the water's surface, bending the mist and the shadows into impossible shapes. I did not step closer. I could not. To do so would be to invite the attention fully, to unravel the fragile safety the rules provided. Yet every fiber of my being screamed to understand, to see the reason my mother had feared, to confront what lay beyond comprehension. I whispered the prayers one final time and retreated slowly from the cliff's edge, keeping my eyes low, my back straight, my mind focused on obedience. The resonance followed me, echoing faintly in the mist, fading only as I returned to the safety of the path leading back toward the town. By the time I reached my house, drenched in sweat and chilled to the bone, I understood something crucial. The rules were not just about survival. They were about acknowledgement and attention, about keeping the vast, indifferent forces at bay. Each glance, each step, each thought carried weight. Every misstep could unravel the membrane the town had preserved for generations. And I also understood that I could not stay confined forever. The cliffs, the docks, the water, they were calling. Patient, indifferent, eternal. I don't know what woke me first that night, the silence or the absence of it. Ravens Point was never truly quiet. The sea always murmured, the fog always pressed, the old house always groaned as if struggling under the weight of memories it wished to forget. But sometime past midnight, I opened my eyes to a stillness so absolute it felt engineered. As if something had reached into the world and pressed its hand against every vibrating surface to hush it. The air was wrong, heavy, too still, too aware. I sat up slowly, the blankets sliding off my shoulders like skin. The candle beside my bed had gone out, leaving only the blue haze of moonlight filtering through the window. Except there was no moon tonight. I froze. A moonless night. Rule 4. My mother's handwriting etched itself across my mind in jagged strokes. Do not go near the water on a moonless night. If the sky is black, the sea is not yours. My pulse kicked into a frantic rhythm. I reached for the journal, flipping through its pages with shaking hands. The map was there. The cliffs, the docks, the circled points pulsing with meaning I didn't want to understand. But there was something else, something I hadn't noticed before. A page I hadn't read, folded once, hidden between two entries about the blue light. I peeled it open. The ink was faded, hurried, almost frantic. The handwriting wasn't steady. If you hear them on a moonless night, do not answer. If they call your name, they do not mean you. If you see the reflection in the window, stay still. Do not blink. It is never your face. My breath shortened. A coldness crawled up my spine, settling beneath my skin like a parasite. And then, as if summoned by the words themselves, something tapped on the window. Once. Soft. Deliberate. Not like branches. Not like wind, something calling attention to itself. My skin tightened, every hair rising. I turned my head a fraction, not enough to look directly, not enough to break the rule, but enough to see movement in the glass. A shape. Tall. Still. exact. It stood inches from the pane, its form outlined faintly by the faint ambient glow of starlight filtering through the fog. I could see my reflection, or something wearing the suggestion of my reflection, shifting within the glass, but the eyes were wrong. Even without looking fully, even from that slight angle, I could feel them. They hummed with awareness, too focused, too sharp, too interested. They didn't belong to any reflection. They didn't belong to me. The tap came again. Marcus. The voice was shapeless, weightless. It carried no breath, no tone, only the suggestion of speech, like a memory of a voice translated into sound by something that had only ever watched humans speak. My lungs refused to fill. I stared ahead at the far wall, reciting the prayers silently, keeping still, not blinking, not breathing too deeply, not acknowledging. The rules were all I had. Marcus. The voice again, closer, as if leaning through the glass. My eyes burned from the effort of staying open. Tears gathered at the corners, stinging, but I didn't dare blink. The journal page echoed through my mind. If you see the reflection, do not blink. Something scraped lightly along the window frame, too slow, too intentional to be an animal. The glass throbbed faintly as if something pressed its weight against it from the outside. Then the whisper changed. It shifted, softened, deepened into something familiar. My mother's voice. "Sweetheart," it breathed. "Open the curtains. I need to see you." My heart shattered against my ribs. I hadn't heard that voice in 16 years, not in dream or memory or echo. My mother never spoke in my sleep. I didn't allow myself to imagine her voice. And yet there it was, warm, fragile, trembling on the edge of a sob. "Marcus, please, I need to see you." My body wanted to move. My mind wanted to scream. The child in me, the boy who clung to her hand while navigating Ravens Point's dangers, wanted to believe. But the adult in me, the one who had read her warnings, who had seen the map, who had felt the attention pressing closer, knew better. I whispered the prayers under my breath. Quiet, small, mechanical. The shape outside shifted, the reflection bending. The glass hummed, vibrating faintly as if something pushed harder against it. "Look at me." The words grew sharper, hungrier. A command, not a plea. The pressure on the window intensified. A hairline fracture formed, splitting across the glass like a lightning bolt. The house groaned, the walls contracting inward, responding to the attention like lungs struggling for air. I forced myself not to look, not to blink, not to answer. The rules were absolute. The rules were the only thing holding the membrane of my world together. The rules, her rules, were all that stood between me and something I could not comprehend. The whisper came again, deeper now. Not my mother. Not human. "Look. At me." And then, the pressure vanished. The glass stilled. The reflection dissolved. The presence withdrew like a tide pulled violently into the depths. Sound returned gradually. The groan of the house, the soft patter of wind against the siding, the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. The world exhaled. I collapsed onto the bed, gasping for air. My vision blurred. My body trembled uncontrollably. The journal page fluttered in my lap as if moved by a breeze that shouldn't be there. A final line, almost invisible in faded ink, caught my eye. "If it comes on a moonless night, it is not here for you. It is here for what you will become." My blood ran cold. Because I understood then, I hadn't just been noticed. I had been claimed. Morning didn't come the way it should have. The darkness thinned, but it never brightened. The sky remained a dull, bruised gray, fog layered so thick it might as well have been stone. My body felt hollow, like something essential had leaked out of me during the night, like something else had tried to climb in. I sat at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of me, hands shaking so badly the pages fluttered. I kept replaying the voice at the window, the reflection that wore my face wrong, the command that dug into the back of my mind like a hook. Even now, I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, as though blinking too slowly might let something else look out through them. The journal rested in the center of the table as if waiting. I stared at it, hating it, needing it. My mother's handwriting filled the pages in steady lines, ink that had faded and warped with time. But something was wrong. Something I hadn't noticed before. Not until the moonless night, not until the whisper that called my name. Some entries were in her hand, others were not. At first glance, they looked similar, close enough that I'd skimmed over them without question. But now, under the gray morning, the differences became impossible to ignore. Her handwriting leaned slightly to the right, the others slanted left. Her ink strokes hesitated at the tail end of certain letters. The others were too smooth, too precise, and the voice of those entries, it wasn't hers. My stomach twisted. I flipped to one of the pages I'd barely noticed before. He will return to where he belongs. He will follow the edge until the edge follows him. He will listen. He will see. The words crawled across the page, wrong in a way language shouldn't be wrong. My mother hadn't written this. She wouldn't have. Something else had been writing in her journal. A tremor passed through my hands. "No," I whispered. "No, that can't be." But the evidence was in front of me. The journal had been in the house long before I returned, and I'd never questioned the parts that didn't make sense, the parts she never would have written in life. I turned to a more recent entry, one I'd assumed belonged to my mother. "If he sees himself in the window, he must not blink." That was her voice. I knew it, but below it, written in the other hand, "If he blinks, I will be here." A coldness spread through my chest like ink blooming in water. That page had not been written by human hands. The house creaked violently, the boards tightening or settling, no bracing. The air shifted, thickening. I snapped the journal shut instinctively, as if closing it would silence whatever had been speaking through it. But then, under the table, the wood thumped. Once, twice, 3 times. As if someone were knocking from the inside of the floor. My heart slammed against my ribs. I backed away, chair scraping hard against the boards. The thumping grew louder, slower, more deliberate. The house was awake, or something inside it was. I remembered Jenny's warning. The town does not forgive curiosity. I had broken too many boundaries in one night, looked too long, listened too closely, opened a page I wasn't meant to open. I took a shaky step toward the hallway, and the overhead light flickered once. Not violently, not threateningly, almost communicatively. Then, from the back of the house, I heard movement. Light, almost playful footsteps, too soft to be human, too quick. The kind of sound a child might make running down a hall, but no children lived near here and none ever visited. I forced myself around the corner, breath stuck in my throat. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, impossibly long, as if the fog outside had seeped into the architecture, bending it inward. Halfway down, a shape stood, small, still, facing the wall. A silhouette, just a silhouette, formed from fog and shadow, pressed flat against the wood like a wet reflection somehow cast without a source. A child-sized form. My muscles locked. Every instinct screamed to freeze, obeying a rule I hadn't even learned yet, but felt etched into my bones. Then slowly, far too slowly, the silhouette turned its head. The sound that followed wasn't a voice, not a whisper, not anything shaped for human ears. It was the sound of recognition. The hallway stretched further still, distorting, bending. The silhouette leaned forward, pulling away from the wall, separating like a peeling sticker. Its edges rippled, struggling to maintain a form. A wave of cold rushed forward, crawling over the floor and up my legs. I stumbled back toward the living room, eyes fixed on the shifting shape. The journal on the table trembled, fluttering open to a page I hadn't turned. Ink bled across the sheet, forming a fresh line as if written by an invisible hand. Do not let it look fully at you. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted for the door, ripping it open and stumbling onto the porch. The fog outside swallowed me instantly, cold and wet and strangely quiet. Behind me, the house exhaled, a long, low groan that sounded almost disappointed. I didn't look back. Couldn't. The fog thickened around me, forming shapes that hinted at movement, shadows in motion, following, watching, whispering attention. Raven's Point wasn't just aware now. It was responding, correcting, closing in. And I realized with a terror so deep it felt bottomless. The rules were not meant to protect me from the town. They were meant to protect the town from me. I didn't sleep again that night. Not really. The fog pressed in through every crack and corner of the house, carrying a weight that made breathing difficult, as if the air itself remembered the boundaries I had broken. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind was magnified into a potential threat. By morning, exhaustion had hollowed me. My limbs felt heavy, my mind stretched thin. But I knew I had to return to the docks. I had to confront what I had avoided, what had called my name on the moonless night, and what lingered in the journal as warnings I could no longer ignore. I wrapped the journal against my chest and stepped outside. The fog swirled around me, forming shapes that suggested depth and movement where none should exist. The air was sharp and metallic, carrying the distant, rhythmic creak of the pier, like a memory echoing through the mist. As I approached, I noticed the first of the markings I had overlooked. Tiny scratches etched into the pilings, almost invisible against the weathered wood. They formed patterns, like the invisible boundaries I had glimpsed in my mother's journal, lines connecting one point to another, guiding attention away from fragile areas. Each mark throbbed with silent warning, as if the wood itself remembered the dangers of the sea and the unseen entities below. I stopped at the edge of the pier, gripping the journal tightly. The water stretched endlessly beneath me, black and still, reflecting nothing but the fog and my own distorted figure. The blue light was not yet present, but I knew it was watching, waiting for the right moment to remind me why my mother had feared it so deeply. The whispers began again, soft at first, indistinct, rising with the rhythm of the tide. I could not understand them, could not respond, could not acknowledge. I only repeated the prayers under my breath, clinging to each syllable like a lifeline. Then a movement in the water, not a wave, not a ripple, but a subtle bending of light, a shifting of something immense just beneath the surface. My pulse raced. I had seen it once before, the blue light, and I knew this was a prelude, a sign that attention had been drawn. I remembered the markings on the pier, the map, the rules. Every step I took had to be deliberate. I forced myself to focus, to obey, to be insignificant. And yet the water pulsed as if alive, as if aware of my presence, bending the fog and shadows toward me. A single plank ahead of me groaned, not under my weight, but under some other force. I stopped, breath frozen, and looked down at the water. The surface quivered, reflecting shapes that were impossible to reconcile with human logic. Then the light appeared. Not a solid glow, not a lantern or reflection. A shimmer, faint at first, spreading across the water in geometric impossibilities. Its edges folded, twisted, and multiplied, moving in ways that contradicted the laws of physics. I wanted to look away, to retreat, but the rules and some deeper instinct told me to hold still, to remain invisible in its gaze. The whispers grew louder, threading into coherent fragments, warning and observing at once. Attention draws the edge. Do not call, do not respond, memorize, but do not understand. The pier seemed to expand beneath me, stretching into impossible dimensions. The markings pulsed faintly with the rhythm of the water, guiding perception, reminding me that obedience was survival. I knelt, pressing the journal against my chest, reciting every prayer, every incantation, every line I had memorized. The light pulsed in response, bending shadows, shifting the fog, touching the edges of perception. And then, almost imperceptibly, the water receded. Not physically, but in attention. The shimmer of the light withdrew, leaving the pier and the air around me heavy with memory. The blue light had not left entirely, it would never leave, but for the moment it allowed me to exist. To be small, insignificant, unnoticed. To obey. I rose slowly, chest tight, hands trembling. The markings along the pier glimmered faintly, a reminder that the town, the docks, the water, all of Ravens Point remembered. They remembered me, my mother, my mistakes, and the attention I had drawn. And I understood finally the true purpose of the rules, not merely to protect me, but to preserve the delicate boundary between the human world and the vast indifferent forces that linger just beyond perception. Obedience was not servitude, it was survival. And survival demanded vigilance. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended haze. I moved through the house and town as if underwater, every sound magnified, every shadow exaggerated. The fog refused to lift, clinging to Raven's Point like a living thing, pressing against walls, doors, and the edges of my awareness. Even when the sun briefly pierced the gray, the world felt dim, unreal, as though I were navigating a dream built on memory and obedience. I returned to the journal constantly, seeking guidance, comfort, or confirmation that I had not overstepped. Each page was a reminder that the rules were not arbitrary. They were shields, fragile and vital. And yet, the markings in the margin, the strange handwriting, the faint pulse of a tension that seemed embedded in the paper made me uneasy. Something was watching through the pages themselves. One afternoon, while tracing the lines of the map with trembling fingers, I noticed something new. A thin, nearly invisible line connecting the house to the cliffs, the docks, and the forest beyond. Unlike the circled points and symbols I had studied before, this line was straight, deliberate, unbroken. It seemed to hum faintly, vibrating in the marrow of my bones. The fog thickened as evening approached. The air became heavy with the smell of salt and decay. I wrapped the journal against my chest and stepped outside, knowing instinctively that I had to confront what lingered. Not the light, not the shapes, but the attention that had begun to weave itself around me like a predator sizing its prey. I walked toward the cliffs first, the path narrow and uneven beneath my feet. The wind carried a low, harmonic resonance, almost musical but entirely alien, pressing against my consciousness. Shapes shifted at the edge of perception, branches that seemed to bend toward me, shadows that stretched and snapped back, and faint echoes of voices, my mother's, Jenny's, my own, overlapping in a chorus of warnings. I paused at the cliff's edge, heart pounding. The water below shimmered faintly, responding to the fog and the invisible line traced from the journal. Then I saw movement. Not in the water, not in the fog, but in the air itself. Ripples, distortions, impossible geometries folding upon themselves, as though the world itself had softened and yielded to some other presence. The whisper came again, threading through the fog. He has returned. He remembers. He obeys. For now. I swallowed, forcing my throat to work. I understand, I muttered. My voice sounded small, insignificant, almost swallowed by the fog. But it was enough. A subtle shift in the air confirmed what I feared. The attention had acknowledged me. It had tested my obedience, measured my restraint, noted my vigilance. The blue light remained absent, but the fog vibrated with awareness. Every gust of wind, every sway of the branches, every faint creak of the cliffs under the weight of the world was a reminder that I was seen, and being seen carried consequences. I sank to the ground, journal in hand, tracing the line that connected the house to the docks and cliffs. It hummed faintly under my fingertips, pulsing with the memory of past generations who had obeyed, who had maintained the boundaries, who had survived. I understood then that Raven's Point itself was alive in its own incomprehensible way, sustained by attention, vigilance, and fear. And I was a part of it now, not merely a resident, but a participant in an ancient, endless pattern. The fog thickened further, curling around my legs, whispering as it swirled, "Do not look, do not call, do not blink, do not step beyond the edge until the edge calls." I nodded to the invisible presence, acknowledging the rules, obeying without question. My body trembled, but my mind remained fixed. Understanding was dangerous, attention was dangerous, disobedience was fatal. But submission, measured, precise, vigilant, was survival. Hours passed. I do not know how long I sat there, tracing the line, whispering the prayers, watching the fog breathe around me. The light did not appear. The shapes did not reach further than the edge of perception. The fog remained, patient, aware, waiting. And in that waiting, I realized a truth more profound than fear or obedience. Survival in Raven's Point was not just following rules. It was becoming part of the vigilance itself, a conscious tether anchoring fragile reality against forces indifferent to humanity. As the fog began to thin just slightly, revealing the dim outlines of the town and the distant pier, I rose slowly, chest tight, limbs aching. The blue light had not claimed me yet, but I knew it could at any moment. And I also knew that I had taken the first step towards something deeper, something my mother had only hinted at in her warnings, a connection to the eternal, the indifferent, the incomprehensible web that held Ravens Point and all its secrets in balance. I returned home, journal pressed to my chest, steps careful, mind alert. The house welcomed me with the familiar creaks, the shadows receding slightly but never fully. The rules remained alive and absolute. The attention lingered, patient, distant, yet inevitable. And I understood my return was no longer just a visit. It was a reawakening. Ravens Point had waited 16 years. Now it would wait no longer. I didn't sleep that night. The fog pressed against the windows like a patient tide, glimmering with the faintest hint of movement. Too slow to be seen directly, too purposeful to be natural. The journal lay open on the table, its pages shifting ever so slightly as if stirred by a breeze that didn't exist. By 2 a.m, I realized the house was no longer just creaking with age. It was responding. Every time I crossed a room, the floorboards groaned in a deliberate sequence behind me, like footsteps that waited for me to finish each movement before continuing. When I stood still, the house did too, as if it were listening for my next decision. My pulse drummed in my ears. Obedience felt suddenly insufficient, not because it wasn't enough, but because something had changed. Something was escalating. Then at exactly 2:24, the journal snapped shut on its own. I flinched, but the air remained still. No wind, no movement, just the weight of attention compressing the walls inward. On the cover, carved faintly through the dust of decades, a message appeared where none had been before. Thin, sharp, like claw marks dragged by an unseen hand. There is a 6th rule. I stared at it until my vision blurred. My mother had never spoken of a 6th rule. Jenny had never hinted at it. It wasn't in the recorded pages. Every instinct told me this was not a warning meant for the old generation of guardians. This was for me. My hands trembled as I slowly reopened the book. The pages turned themselves, once, twice, 3 times, before landing on an empty sheet near the back. Ink bled up from the paper like oil rising through water, forming new handwriting I didn't recognize. Rule 6, when the fog speaks your name, do not answer. A chill slid along my spine. Almost immediately, the fog tapped on the window, softly like a person knocking with one knuckle. Once, twice, 3 times. I swallowed hard. No, I whispered to myself, not yet. The 4th knock came, slower this time. Then through the thick white wall outside, I heard it. My name. Not shouted, not whispered, but spoken with perfect familiarity, as though someone had leaned close to my ear. Evan. My heart lurched into my throat. I forced myself to step backward. The voice followed, muffled but distinct, seeping through the glass. Evan, open the door. The rules clattered through my mind like falling stones. Don't look at the light. Don't go outside after dark. Don't approach the water during the thick fog. Never enter the forest without being invited. Always answer when the lighthouse knocks. And now, do not answer when the fog speaks your name. I inhaled sharply through my teeth, grounding myself. My mother had raised me inside these rules. Her voice lived beneath my skin. But she had never prepared me for this. A 6th rule meant something was different now, something growing, waking, shifting in response to my return. The fog tapped again, harder this time. I stepped back further, gripping the edge of the table. You aren't real, I muttered. Your pressure, your mimicry. But the voice that replied was not mine, nor my mother's, nor Jenny's. It was deeper, slower, vibrating with a depth too vast to comprehend. You obey. But you do not yet understand. Come and see. I clamped a hand over my mouth. That voice didn't call me by name. It didn't need to. It called to something in me, something old, buried under layers of memory and fear. The floorboards beneath my feet began to shudder, subtly, rhythmically. Not in panic, in expectation. The house wasn't protecting me anymore. It was waiting for my decision. I backed into the hallway, each step echoing like a countdown. The air shimmered at the edges of my vision, reality thinning as though something pressed from the other side. The rules, the only structure keeping Ravens Point tethered, felt suddenly fragile. Then the journal snapped shut again, louder this time, sharp enough to crack through the fog's whispers. On the cover, another line appeared beneath the sixth rule. If you ever answer, the light will no longer need to knock. My breath stopped. A sudden pounding, 3 brutal, heavy blows slammed against the front door. Not from the fog now. This was different. Familiar. The lighthouse. My blood ran cold. The pounding came again. It was the same sound I'd heard as a child when the light demanded attention. But tonight, the fog still called my name between each strike. 2 voices, 2 forces, 2 rules intertwining. The light wanted me to answer. The fog wanted me to open. The journal warned me about one, but remained silent about the other. The pounding grew faster, desperate. You must answer when the lighthouse knocks. You must not answer when the fog speaks your name. Both rules were absolute. And tonight, both were happening at the same time. My knees weakened. This wasn't a test. This was a choice. One no generation before me had ever faced. The journal vibrated violently, pages fluttering like wings. A final line burned into the last blank space, glowing faintly. Choose which world you belong to. The fog scratched at the window, whispering my name like a lover. The lighthouse hammered the door with ancient authority, and in the echo between those forces, the human world felt suddenly paper-thin. My breath quivered. I stepped forward. I reached for the door, and then I made my choice. End of story.